can go into there. I'm going to explain something before we go in. Hello. Good evening. I'm going to explain something before we go in, so do come on. Do come in. Good evening, good evening. I'm going to explain something before we go in, so everyone, I'm going to get you all to wait here. Come on up. I'm going to say a few things before we go in, so come on up. Okay? Good evening. Hello. Good evening, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? So I am Rob, and you're going to be your host for this evening. And we're going to do something a little bit different here this evening, which is that we have, for the first time in the history of Porto, turned this room here into a time portal. Ooh. And you were here this evening in history. You will be able to tell your grandchildren that you were here for this historic occasion. So there is one thing that I need to ask you to do first in order for this to work. The first thing is I have to teach you a very simple tool that we use a lot in the transition movement, which is if you see me put my hand in the air, you put your hand in the air too. Quick practice. You put your hand in the air too, thank you, and then you stop talking. And I have observed already in my 11 days here in Portugal that sometimes people, they put their hand up and they just carry on talking, and that's not the idea. So if we can do that, would be beautiful. What I would love you to do before we go in would be for you to make a pair with somebody you did not know when you arrived here this evening. So look around you, find a person, they will be your pair, and make a pair with that person. Thank you. So, does everybody have a pair? Put your hand up if you don't have a partner. Okay, so do you know these? Do you know these two? Okay, so you could be, and then there's a gentleman at the back there. Oh no, sorry. Anybody else? You okay? You two know each other? Yeah. Do you know him? No. So one of you can go with him. Anybody else? And this lady here. Okay, so anybody else not have a partner? Don't be shy. Yes, there is a woman there at the back. Can you see there is a woman here? Yes? You okay? Go, maybe you can find her. So you might be, and a woman here. Anybody else? Anybody else not have a partner? Okay. So you might be wondering why we do that. So I always do this in my talks. We have just lived through 2 years where we didn't go out of our houses and didn't see anybody at all. And we live in a time that sociologists describe as an epidemic of loneliness. And so even if tonight turns out to be the worst talk you ever went to in your whole life, you will have met one person you didn't know before you came. And I think that's really, really important. And I've done this now with thousands of people, and so far I've had 4 couples who came up to me and said, you know that thing you do in your talks, that's how we met each other. And one baby. So this is a very powerful exercise, potentially. So in a moment we're going to open the doors here, and I have brought with me all the way from England my time machine, and I will explain more about this very powerful technology shortly, but this is how it works. This is some serious quantum stuff here. I don't know if you can see at the back. This is some very, very powerful quantum technology here. You'll see it inside. And what we have done is we have turned this room here into a time portal into 2030. Ooh, that doesn't happen every day. So in a moment we are going to step through. When you go through that door, you are traveling forward 6 years into the future. Not to any 2030, to the 2030 that was the result of us doing absolutely everything we could have possibly done between now and then. My friends, they were the most exhilarating 6 years to live through. Incredible. Change happened so quickly. It's not a utopia. It's also not a dystopia. This is very, very important. It is the 2030 that resulted from us doing everything we could possibly have done. So in a moment, we're going to count up to 2030. And when we do, we will go through the doors. And my invitation is, please, to enter into the room in silence. And notice in yourself as you step through the door and you step 6 years into the future, does the air feel different? Does it taste different? Do you feel different as you step into that future? And in silence, find a seat next to your partner, and then we will go from there. Does that all make sense? Okay, so I'm going to turn on my time machine now and set it for 2030, and then we're gonna count up through the years. So 2024, 2025, I can't hear you, 2026, 2027, 2028, 2029, 2030. So thank you for joining me here in 2030. So yeah, I'm Rob Hopkins, one of the people who started the transition movement. I wrote a book called From What Is to What If, which we have outside, and I'm going to talk a bit about time travel. So this is where the time travel program that I just explained to you was developed. This is the small town that I live in the southwest of England. It's called Totnes. And for the last 5 or 6 years, we've been working very hard to develop this, and it works, and it's fantastic. And you've all just experienced the power of this quantum technology, okay? And so deep underneath the castle in the middle of the town, next one, please, Philippa. We have a time travel project, and this is my colleague, in case you're still doubting the power of this time machine. This is myself and my colleague, and we regularly travel to 2030 together in order to explore there and to bring back recordings and photographs and things that document what we found there when we arrived. As you can see there, we travel through in order to gather these things up together, okay? And in case you're still, okay, next. In case you're still wondering whether you still need any convincing, somebody was in my house the other day, and they happened to be filming in my kitchen, and they caught a little clip of film of me setting off on one of my adventures to 2030. So we're just going to show you this now, in case there's still anyone wondering. Next, here we are. So you see, this is a very powerful technology that we are using here. And so why are we doing this? And in a moment, we're going to do a bit more. But I just want to set the context of why it is that we develop this extraordinary technology. And it's really because of the climate and ecological emergency that we are facing right now, which is very complex, but it can be distilled down into some very simple key points, I think. It's warming. We see it happening around us. It's measurable. The world is warming and is on a trajectory to get warmer and warmer. It's us. There is no doubt about that at any stage. At this point, it is driven by human activity, by the burning of fossil fuels. Yes, we're sure. There's no doubt about it anymore. Number 4, it's bad. I regularly say to people, if you are not regularly terrified about climate change, you are not paying attention to what is happening in the world right now. This is the existential challenge to the survival of everything that we love as human beings. And number 5, we can do something about this. We are not passive bystanders in this situation. We don't, all the very worst case scenarios we can very much avoid in terms of what happens next. I think it's working actually, Filipina. So I'm only going to show you one graph this evening, I promise, because you've all had a very long day. But this, in terms of what we can do about it, the closest thing that we have is the Paris Agreement, signed, as you might imagine, in Paris in 2015. The Paris Agreement sets out the pathway in which the world can actually respond. The Paris Agreement wasn't ambitious enough, but it's the best that we have. That says that by 2030, we, that is the people in the global north, need to have cut our carbon emissions in half. In half by 2030. It's just 6 years away. And we have to have met that target in order to have any chance of meeting the targets for 2050. So what fascinates me in the work that I do, and I'm not here to negotiate with physics, these are the limits that we have. So what fascinates me is, what would that 2030 be like if we had done everything we needed to do to get to that point, where we had cut our emissions in half and we were firmly on track to get to where we need to get to. As the writer Bell Hooks once said, what we cannot imagine cannot come into being. We have to be able to imagine that world in as sensory and as seductive a way as possible. And that's really what we're going to talk about this evening, is what would that look like if we actually managed to do that. So I think there are 2 different ways that we can think about the oil age. We're all living through the oil age, this extraordinary period in history where we discovered under our feet this incredible condensed energy source and used it to build an entire civilization based on the idea that we would always have access to this stuff. But it has caused such harm and such damage. And there are 2 ways, I think, that we can think about the time that we're in now. We could either think about the oil age like this, as being like a big mountain that we have heroically climbed to the top of over the last 200 years. And now we stand there on top of this mountain, those of us in the world's wealthier nations, and underneath our feet is more carbon, more debt, more inequality, more anxiety than we ever stood on top of before. And the guides who are at our side, who know this mountain really well, are telling us we need to get down off this mountain really quickly. You can see the storm clouds that are coming in. We need to get down off here. For some people, being told by the guides that that's what we need to do, that's enough. They're the experts, right? They know the mountain, that's okay. But for a lot of people, that doesn't seem to work. So what I wonder, and what I try to do in my work, is to try a different tool, which is to tell stories about the lower slopes of that mountain, of the valleys that wait for us, of the delicious food and wine, the comfortable mattresses, the warm firesides, the dry socks that are waiting for us if we can find a way down off that mountain. Then it's about giving people something to move towards, not just something to run away from. The other way we can think about the oil age is to turn that graph upside down, and instead to see it as being like a deep, dark lagoon that we dived into 200 years ago because somebody told us that if only we got to the bottom of it, there was gold and treasure thrown in there thousands of years ago. And we've gone deeper and deeper, and the deeper we've gone, it's got darker and it's harder to see each other. And actually now we've realized there is no gold at the bottom, and we're pushing away from that. And every stroke we take towards the surface is a move towards something, towards clean air, being able to see each other, feel the sun on our face again. So those are the 2 different ways, I think, that we can really think about the time that we're in. So I want to do a little activity with you, if I may, which is to ask if you might all close your eyes and to make yourself comfortable. And to imagine that you are leaving, to imagine that here in this 2030 that we travel to when we open the doors, that you are taking a step out through this building in your imagination, out into the Porto of 2030, and to take a walk around. And we'll just take a minute or so in silence for you to take a walk around. And use all of your senses. What does that Porto smell like? What does it feel like? What does it taste like? What do you hear? What do you see as you walk around in those radically lower carbon, much more equal, much more connected streets of Porto in 2030? So if you keep your eyes closed, could you turn to your partner and we'll just take a couple of minutes to share with them. What did you see? What did you feel? What did you smell? How was that? Off you go. Thank you. Thank you. It would be lovely if anybody had any impressions you'd like to share, anything that surprised you or delighted you, just a few words, any impressions you'd like to share. There's a microphone coming to you. It's all very official. Okay.
Hello. In the very beginning, the image that I got was just terrible, as if I could not think of anything good in front of us. But then I just left the dust come down, and things were improving, and there were children, space, freedom. It was nice.
Thank you. Thank you. Somebody else.
So I was really surprised because of the smell. It came from homemade cookies. It was incredible. And there were children playing outside and no cars at all. And it was tea time. It's tea time. And I was invited by the community to have tea with them. So it was incredibly good.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Making me hungry. Who else would like to share an impression? I don't bite. Then we get lady here.
Yeah, my impression was not as happy. I did feel a lot of noise. I just heard a lot of noise, a lot of pressure, heat. The pollution was very high, and there was a lot of noise and traffic and tuk-tuk and all this that we are seeing at the moment was even bigger.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
Hi. I dreamt of the best I could. So a lot more trees, especially fruit trees. So the smell came from the trees. Any kind of fruits, oranges preferably, because citrus is very good for calming down. And everybody walking because cars were outside the city, and buses and other means of public transportation were circulating with regularly enough to take everybody wherever they could.
Thank you. Thank you very much. One more. Is there anybody who would still like to say something? Yes.
Well, besides a lot of things that were already shared, people moved to the town. Really people from Porto, not tourists. So could see a lot of locals living here and with children around and no traffic.
Thank you. Thank you. Anything that anyone is anything unsaid that you were thinking you'd like to say? This lady here. Birds. Very short and sweet, thank you, birds. Thank you very much. So I've done that exercise now with thousands and thousands of people. I did it with 1,500 people in a hall in Belgium one time. And what always fascinates me is how similar the responses are. And I read a paper recently, a research paper by a woman who was doing the same exercise in prisons in America 25 years ago. Exactly the same things that people said. And for me, I feel like it's an activity that should be like a daily practice, like meditation or yoga, for example. Because the reality is that doing the opposite of that is a daily practice. Every morning we wake up, we turn on our phone, and into our brain comes all these messages saying, it's too late, you can't do anything, everyone's horrible, there's no point even trying, everything's completely broken, why bother? And we do that every day, many, many, many times a day, and we never make space for the possibility that that's not where it goes, and that actually we did do something. And so that's why I feel like this really needs to become something that we become much, much better at. So the reason why I think it's so important is because this is about the cultivation of longing for me. That for a long time in the climate movement, the messaging has been about collapse and extinction and trying to terrify people into action by pointing at the dark storm clouds that are coming in. But what if instead the aim of our movements was the creation of longing? And so I want to tell you a little story about longing. So in 1865, Jules Verne wrote a book called From the Earth to the Moon, and he pulled together all the best science he could find at that time about how we might actually get from the Earth to the Moon. And it was such an exciting, thrilling story that it inspired scientists to start thinking about how might we actually do that? What would it look like if we did it? What would we need to get there? Many of the things in his book were very, very accurate. For example, he said the rocket would be built out of aluminium, it would have three astronauts in it, it would take off from Florida, Florida. Other things weren't so accurate. In his book, the rocket was fired out of an enormous cannon, and we now know that if you did that, as soon as you pressed the button, the astronauts would be turned into something like passata in a fraction of a second. But his book was so exciting that it inspired people to make films, to make stories. So the first film, one of the first films in 1902 by Georges Méliès was called A Trip to the Moon, about how astronauts went to the moon. And it was starting to build this longing, collective longing that we would get to the moon. Okay, next one. So you had this whole genre of popular science magazines. At the same time, you had comic books. Mighty Mouse went to the moon. You had jazz dances about walking on the moon. In all of our culture, it started to build. Okay, they were dreadful in the 1950s. There was this genre of terrible, terrible films about all-male crews of astronauts going to the moon to find there were loads of women living on the moon who hadn't seen any men for ages and ages. It's a very strange male fantasy, I think. So this one was called Cat Women of the Moon, and you can find Cat Women of the Moon on YouTube. It is one of the worst films you've ever seen in your life. It says at the top, "See the lost city of love-starved cat women." And I was looking at this picture the other day, and I thought, you'd imagine if they were gonna take the effort of going all the way to the moon to find all these women who hadn't seen men for ages, that they would at least look happy about it, but they all look terrified. And really, really not very happy about it. It says you've never seen anything like it, and having seen it, I can agree. It's really, really appalling. But there was about 9 of these films that were made at that time. So in the culture, the longing was building. Tintin, of course, very famously went to the moon. And it meant that in 1963, when JFK announced that we were going to go to the moon, standing in front of a man trying very hard not to sneeze, it meant that actually we had already been there many, 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 many times. In songs, in dances, in comic books, in science books. We had been rehearsing going to the moon for such a long time that the longing became very powerful. It meant that when Neil Armstrong actually did land on the moon, Hergé, who draws the Tintin cartoons, made this cartoon of Tintin and his friends welcoming Neil Armstrong to the moon. Welcome to the moon, Mr. Armstrong. So the longing comes first. If we want any big changes to happen, we have to start. We don't have 100 years for climate change, but there's a lot that we can learn from that, I think. And I'm always very inspired by, the Institute for the Future in America, on the window of their building, they have this beautiful quote: "Any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous." I'm a great believer in the ridiculous. I'm kind of here this evening to urge you all in the work you do to be more ridiculous. Because we have left climate change so late that any solution that is proposed that doesn't initially look at least a bit ridiculous is not ambitious enough. We don't have time for little changes where we change a tax code here and change a little something here. We don't have time for that anymore. We need things that are bold and audacious and beautiful and ridiculous. I spoke last year in a conference in Switzerland with 400 young people who were all passionate about regenerative food and farming and agriculture. Fantastic. Lots of really dynamic energy in the room from all these young people. And the man who spoke before me was from one of the biggest supermarkets in Switzerland. And 4 times in his talk he said, "And I urge you to be pragmatic." And when it was my turn to speak, I said, "Please don't be pragmatic. The last thing the world needs now is another pragmatic generation. Be ridiculous, be bold, be audacious. That's what we need right now." So as I said, with my colleague Mr. Kit, we travel into the future and we visit things like the underground mushroom production of 2030, where so much protein and medicines and even construction materials now are being made underneath our city using mushrooms. I visit the incredible new agricultural systems of 2030 and what's happening there. What I want to do is to tell you about a recent trip that we took to 2030. So you might like to think of me as being like the Marco Polo of the climate movement, taking great adventures into the future and then coming back to tell you the stories of those adventures. So we started in this street. You know this street. This is just about 3 streets down from where you live, and the third one on the right, you know the one? And we set our time machine up here in this street, here in Porto, and we set the controls for 2030, and we pressed go. And when we stepped out into that 2030, it looked like this. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Thank you. It's just 6 years. And the first impression that we had when we stepped out was firstly, how much cleaner the air was in that world. Secondly, as my friend here said, how much louder the bird song was. Much, much louder. Birds we couldn't even recognize. But thirdly, there's a look in people's eyes, a sense of, do you know what, I think we might just make this. We might just do this. A sense of shared common purpose and collective effort that was just a beautiful, beautiful thing to see. And if you turn around and look the other way down that street, it looked like this. It was amazing. Because from the future, there are so many different threads into the future. We talk often about the future like it's one thing, like it's all kind of preset, that it's like the present just with better phones and more electric cars. But there are so many different quantum threads into the future. Some of them take us to futures that are absolutely horrible. Believe me, I've been to see them. We don't want to go there. Trust me on that. But some of them, a few of them, on the outer edges of possibility are extraordinary, but still remain possible. Okay, so then, and I have to tell you, the bicycle rush hours of Porto in 2030 were the most extraordinary thing to see. Every morning, every evening, like a river of bicycles, because what had happened in Porto was that the infrastructure had been built to make that possible. It was realized in 2024 that every €1 million that is spent building really good infrastructure for cycling actually saves us €19 million off the national health bill. It's not an expense. It's an investment in health and well-being. And so the government very quickly built the infrastructure, and just as we see it back in 2024 in Paris, in all the cities where that infrastructure gets built, people use it. And it was the same here. So all that you might remember in 2024, those signs that would tell you digitally how many spaces there were in the car parks, we now have the same for bicycles. They're all in Dutch. Don't ask me why. Something happened, I think, in 2026 that nobody wanted to talk to me about. But they were all in. And so, because we built so much parking space for underground bicycles, all those underground car parks, you remember the underground car parks of 2024, we didn't need them anymore. And they all got turned instead into these incredible, beautiful, clean underground bike parking, completely free, and people used it, and they were absolutely full of bikes. And it made me think back to 2023, when I went on holiday with my wife to Wales, and we saw this. We spent 10 minutes looking at this, trying to figure out what we were supposed to do with that. If any of those of you here ride a bicycle and you can explain what we were supposed to do, I'd love to hear. In the end, all we could think was you turned your bicycle upside down and you glued it onto the street. Because back then we were building cycling infrastructure, but most of it was rubbish and people didn't really use it. By 2030, it's incredible. Now, when you step out of every station in Porto and all around Porto, this is what you see. Because we built the infrastructure and people used it. And it was so much easier than not doing it, okay? And you might remember as well the trend in 2024 was that cars got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger every year. By 2030, that process had gone into reverse. As the culture started to change, you started to see little things like this on the streets of the city, much, much better to live with, much safer for children and for everybody to have cars like this. And as we walked around in that world of 2030, we noticed as well that the new houses that were being built were being done very, very differently from the new houses of 2024. Because we realized in 2024 that 9% of all of climate change was driven by the use of cement and concrete in construction. We just could not carry on using that stuff anymore. So we had to reimagine how to build houses. So these houses that we saw just on the edge of Porto here were built using straw and clay and timber, all from the region around Porto. So you could around the city there was a new industry emerging to process those materials and to make them into things that people could use. So the homes were so much warmer and beautiful and dry and ecological and healthy, just gorgeous. And even when we build bigger buildings now in the middle of the city, they're built using timber from the region, built in a very different kind of a way, very, very strong, fireproof, extraordinary how quickly that change happened as well. And even some buildings now we went to see, as I mentioned, use mycelium-based, mushroom-based materials for construction. These are, instead of using boards on the wall, we use boards that are made using mycelium. Incredible. And we saw so many streets throughout the city that had been closed to cars, where the people on that street had organized to take that space back, to liberate that space from the control of the cars. And they were very pleased to show us a picture of what this street used to look like back in 2024. It used to look like this. And that change, again, happened so quickly, and people were so pleased to have this space, a shared space that they could come together and celebrate in. You can see the backwards and forwards there between the two, okay? Okay, and because one of the changes that made this possible was that we stopped measuring the success of our economy just using GDP as the measure. This idea that an economy is only any good if it's bigger this year than it was last year, which is an extraordinary way of evaluating how successful something is. I have sons, and what I want my boys to do is to grow, ideally till they're just slightly smaller than me, and then to grow in other ways, to become kinder and wiser and more skilled. If I just gauged the success of my children by the fact that they're bigger this year than they were last year, and they were about 30 meters tall, something would feel like it was horribly wrong in the world somehow. But for an economy, we take that's fine. So by 2030, we've stopped that ridiculous idea, and instead what we do is measure the things that actually matter. The number of children able to play out in the street, the number of girls able to cycle home on their own after dark, the number of people with good teeth, the stuff that actually really matters. So we're building an economy that measures well-being and happiness rather than growth. And everywhere we went, one of the sights that gave me the most excitement was this, the removal of concrete and tarmac, because we realized in those hot summers of 2024, 2025, that when you get above 32, 33 degrees, this stuff is really, really dangerous to have in cities. It holds heat. It's really, really dangerous. So the depaving industry has grown incredibly quickly. This removal of hard surfaces from the city, which already in 2024 there were pioneers of this. The city of Leuven in Belgium had a budget of millions of euros every year for the removal of hard surfaces throughout the city. And so by 2030, Porto feels softer, more porous as a result. We went to visit a school playground which had been completely depaved a few years before. They showed us a picture of what it had looked like back in 2024, and you saw the same thing all over the place. It was like a program of liberating soil across the city. It was fantastic. And so by 2030, I've actually brought you back something from the future, something very, very precious, which is the front page of Forbes magazine in 2030, which is the top jobs, the most aspirational careers that young people leave school in 2030 wanting to take up. And you'll see that the third one there is being a depaver, removing concrete and tarmac, along with seaweed farming, people growing food on rooftops, people who are imagination activists, mushroom growers, because the culture changed through this process as well as all of this stuff started to happen. We visited whole neighborhoods now that are being redesigned with no space for cars. The cars are being designed out of the fabric of whole neighborhoods now. And I mentioned that we go to these places to record what it sounds like, and I'm going to play you one of those recordings shortly. But in this place, I went there thinking, well, I know what it'll sound like. It will sound like children playing, it'll sound like bicycles and birdsong and things. Yes, it sounded like those things, but it also sounded like being able to hear people have piano lessons in their houses, for example, which you couldn't hear before because of the background noise of the cars. When you take away that noise, you hear the world in so much more detail. And this place was just incredible. So many bicycles and all this new infrastructure that had been created. And I mentioned before that I was going to play you an actual recording from the future that I've brought back just for you the other day from this place in the future. So this is actually a recording of the center of the city of Porto in 2030. So this, you might again like to close your eyes and imagine you're stepping out from here into the center of Porto, and it's a future of public transport and bicycles and these streets filled with children playing and birdsong. And you might like to just close your eyes. It lasts about a minute, and to imagine that that's what it sounds like. So we bring back many recordings like that from the future, and I'll tell you a little bit later a bit more about what we do with them as well. And one of the reasons why we do that is it's very interesting, the science about what happens in our brain when we imagine the future. So if we're imagining the future, or if we're remembering the past, exactly the same networks activate in our brains. Because imagining the future, what we do is then we go to our memory and look through it, and then we put things together, and then that's what the imagination part is. So if I said to my friend here, I'm going to take you on holiday to Italy next week, and you've never been before, then what happens is your brain sends a request to your memory and says, give me a file with Italy written on the front. Everything you've ever heard about Italy, and then your imagination pieces that together and builds you a picture of Italy. So if you just watch Fox News all day, it's incredibly hard to imagine a low-carbon future because you have nothing to work with. So what I try to do is to help people in as multi-sensory a way as possible to try and really build strong imaginings of what that future could be like. And sound is a very powerful way of doing that, I think. We went to visit this place, which is a school, because the education system of 2030 is very, very different to the present. Testing was abolished in schools in 2026. And instead, the education system is based around teaching critical thinking and kindness and imagination, the things that really, really matter. And this school was designed by the students in the school. They worked with an architect for a year. And it turns out when you ask children to design their own school, they say it should have a rainforest in the middle. So I'm very pleased to tell you that in 2030, Portugal has reached its target of 60% of schools having a rainforest in the middle, which has led to a huge improvement in mental health for young people across the country. And our food and farming system really changed as well. We saw everywhere we went, those big fields were being broken into smaller fields. We saw a lot more agroforestry, a lot more biodiversity in terms of how food was happening, food was being grown. The amount of meat that people were eating had fallen quite significantly, but the beautiful thing was nobody really even noticed that transition happening. It just kind of happened. And around where we live, go back one, Felipe, around where we live, our landscapes started to become much more useful, much more productive. Many more people were involved, even in small patches, in growing a little bit of their own food. You don't see very much lawn, grass anymore in 2030 because we came to see that it was just a bit of a waste of space and we could use it so much better. And that led to a real change in our landscapes. And as we went around, we just saw so many places where productive plants were being woven into the fabric of our towns and cities. That art that people had perfected in 2024 of designing completely useless landscapes was something we decided to move away from and to make space productive and useful for everybody. And in many places that we went to, we found that actually there was no flooding anymore, even though the rains were heavier in some places. And that was because we had developed the humility to recognize that beavers are much better hydrological engineers than human beings could ever possibly be. And the uplands where all those floodwaters came from, we just gave them back to the beavers, and the beavers re-engineered them into these incredible biodiverse landscapes that held huge amounts of water and led to an explosion of wildlife in those places. To visit, I love beavers. And to visit landscapes created by beavers in this way is just absolutely magical. It's like going to a really nice version of Jurassic Park. Like, it feels really different, but kind of in a, not that you're about to be eaten by, anyway, you know what I mean. Okay. And the food system, as I said, is very different. Now, we went to visit this place where they grow 80% of all the food for all the local schools in this place. The municipality bought land, created a market garden. They grow food that is then used in the schools. The kids come out from the school and help in the place. It led to a huge improvement in diet and eating and started to ripple out through the community of that place. It was an extraordinary thing that happened. And many of the transformation that happened in the food system was already in place. It's not like this future just fell out of the sky, magic, and fully formed in 2029. There was a lot of it already happening back in 2024, if only we knew where to look. And so this is a city in Belgium called Liège. And in Liège, they had started the most incredible food revolution back in 2014, if you can remember back that far. And in 2014, the local transition group, the community group, came together around a what-if question. They said, what if, in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? Such a beautiful question. It inspired people to come together and to think around that. Then by 2018, they had already raised 5 million euros of investment from the people of Liège, investing into 30 new cooperatives, not from the bank, not from the municipality. They had already started 4 shops in the center of the city, a brewery, which I had to go and visit. You know, we all have to make sacrifices for the revolution. And I met the guy who had raised 2.5 million euros to start a community vineyard, a cooperative vineyard. I said, how did you do that? And he said, it's Belgium. People like wine. People have some money. Don't be afraid. And so from that, they built this incredible thing. Then by 2024, the municipality was now very involved and very supportive. They'd invested 2 million euros to build a food logistics hub for local food on the edge of the city. They were providing meals into all the local schools. This model had already spread to 6 other cities in Belgium. This extraordinary revolution that was happening. In 2023, the mayor of Liège made me an honorary citizen of Liège. And he gave me, because he said, before this, everybody thought Liège was a bit rubbish. And you go around the world telling everyone how amazing Liège is. You're like an ambassador for our city. Have this medal. I said, thank you very much. Could I also have my European citizenship back, please? He said, I'm afraid that's not a power that I have, Mr. Hopkins. So, I'll have the medal then. Okay. Okay. So, and also most of our energy now comes from renewable energy. In a place like this with such an abundance of sunshine, the process by which that was then harnessed happened very, very quickly. But the really smart thing was that more than half of that energy is owned by us. Is owned by people, not by big companies. The community energy revolution swept through Portugal in 2026, 2027, and now there is solar and wind in so many places, but it's owned by us, and we benefit from it. It's a much more attractive thing than putting your money into the bank to be invested into energy within our community. So I'm just going to take a pause and take a step back to 2024. As William Gibson, the science fiction writer, said, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Everything I've told you, every story I've told you from 2030 already exists here in the world today. We started our journey in Amsterdam, we went to Barcelona, then we went to the bicycle rush hour of Utrecht. We saw the new housing being built in Leeds. We visited this crazy school that is being built in Madrid. We visited the beaver ponds of Cornwall, the depaved schoolyards of Val de Roye in France, the reclaimed streets of Lausanne, the car-free neighborhoods of Freiburg in Germany, the new school food system of Montsartou in France. We're not waiting for someone to invent something extraordinary. You can go and see this future right now, wherever in all of these places. So what's missing, I think, is the storytelling, is the longing, is the creation of desire for that future, because we know that it's possible, because we can already go and see it. But somehow we just convince ourselves over and over again we have created a culture, a yes but culture that stands in the way of things moving forward. So I want to do another little exercise with you, if I might, which really needs you to look out for my hand going up into the air. And you're going to need your partner again. Hopefully you still have your partner with you. So this is an exercise which goes in 3 rounds. And look out for my hand going up, because that's my signal to say the round has finished. Okay? And what you're doing in each round with your partner is you're going to take it in turns to make suggestions for a picnic. And the role of the other person is to respond, and then you change over. So it's like suggestions tennis. You take it in turns to make suggestions, okay? And in the first round, the role of the second person is to just respond to the suggestion with as much negativity as you can. Just as negatively as you can. I'll bring some tostadas. Oh, the last time I ate your tostadas, I was in hospital for 6 months. And I said I would never again touch your disgusting tostadas. Not going to happen. And then you change over and then the other person makes a suggestion. Is that clear? Does that make sense? Okay, and look out for my hand, and off you go. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so for the second round, it's the same. You're going to take it in turns to make suggestions. This time the role of the second person is to respond, to accept that invitation, but just with absolutely no enthusiasm at all. I'll bring a cake. Well, I mean, if you must, I suppose. If you really must bring a cake, then bring a cake. Like that. Okay? Go. Thank you. So I imagine, so those of you who are here who are involved in activism in some way, who are trying to change things around you in the world you work in or study in, did those first two feel a little familiar? We just meet this sort of yes but response all the time to so many things. So what we're going to do now is the third one. This is the yes and one. Okay, so you're going to accept your partner's suggestion, and you're going to add to it. And then they're going to add to that. And then you're going to add to that. And you're going to create something extraordinary and ridiculous that can only exist because you do that. So I'll bring some champagne. Oh, yes. And we could open a special champagne bar down by the river. Yes. And we could invite Rod, we invite Elton John to come and play the piano with big glasses. Yes. And we could make those glasses out of some special Porto cake or something. So you allow it to go in extraordinary directions because you listen to each other. Okay? Enjoy. Off you go. Thank you. Did that one feel a little bit different to the other two? In what way?
Because you were always imagining something else.
Because you were always imagining something else, yeah? And there was more enthusiasm?
It didn't seem that impossible.
It didn't seem that impossible, actually? Happiness? Yeah, a community. There was more creativity, yeah, that you were able to access. It's such a beautiful exercise to watch from the front here. I had the privileged place to be here watching you all do that. It's like the room fills up with laughter and really bright eyes and connection, and you're all listening to each other. It's like I've been involved in the environmental movement in some ways since I was about 14. And it's always felt like there's this unspoken belief that it's only going to be successful if it feels like a long walk home in the rain on a cold November Thursday. That if you're having too much fun, you're somehow not taking it seriously and not doing it properly. I think it needs to feel like that. My invitation would be for you to put that feeling of doing that activity in a little bottle that you take home and open it when you need it. And try in the groups that you're in organizations that you're in conversations that you're in, to build a kind of a yes and culture among the people in that, because it's really, really powerful. So thank you for doing that. I hope you enjoyed that. And I just had a couple more things that I wanted to share with you before we move on, before we have some questions. So I saw about 4 years ago, I saw a T-shirt that a young woman was wearing at a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington. And it said on it, "I've been to the future, we won." And it gave me goosebumps. It may be giving you goosebumps now, I don't know. And it profoundly changed the way that I thought about the activism that I do. I could have spent this evening giving you a talk with lots of facts and figures and graphs and reasons why we need to build this kind of energy system or make a transition to that kind of food system. But actually, I think there's something really powerful about giving a lived experience of that, of saying, "I've been to the future, we won, it's incredible." Tomorrow, when you go to work, when you arrive back at university, when you meet your friends, you'll be able to say to them, "I've been to the future. It's amazing. Rob Hopkins took me there in his time machine last night." And what I find is that actually what we need to be doing is making the kind of activism that we do so much more seductive and sensual, and to talk about what it would smell like and feel like and taste like. It's such a different way of accessing this stuff. And when you combine it with being really playful with time, I'm just finishing, so the book that's out here, I'm just finishing writing the next book that will come out next year in English, which is going to be called How to Fall in Love with the Future. That's based on meeting extraordinary different activists around the world who are playing with time in the most beautiful and extraordinary ways. Two incredible women in North Philadelphia who run a project called Black Quantum Futurism, who talk about time and black liberation politics in ways that are just incredible, and building time machines, they're just absolutely glorious. A Canadian artist called Camille Turner, who does a project called Afronautic Research Labs, where she does loads of research about the slave trade that existed in Canada, which nobody really talks about. Everybody in America, we know about the slave trade in the United States, but Canada has somehow managed to paint itself as being the nice guys, the safe place that people could run away to. It wasn't quite like that. And so she has collected a whole load of research from that, laminates it, puts it on a table in a room that's darkened with just lamps. And when people come in, they're invited to come in. She gives them a magnifying glass. They're invited to come in and read this research. That's a lovely project on its own. But the role of the Afronauts is really interesting. Two people of color who wear very ceremonial robes, who stand in the corner and just watch. They don't say anything. They just are there to bear witness. And the story is they have traveled from the future back to the present to witness this extraordinary historical moment where people come to understand the impact of the slave trade. So using the future to understand the past, to inform the present. You know, so much of activism just gets stuck in the present. When do we want it? Now. But actually there's some beautiful work that plays around with time and with time travel in this way. I mentioned before about why we collect these recordings and what I do. In the work that I do a lot of work around trying to make this as playful as possible. I'm working with an amazing Belgian cartoonist to do a comic book of our adventures into 2030 to collect these recordings, the world that we went to see, okay? And the recordings that I go to visit many places that already sound like the future needs to sound like, and then I work with this amazing young ambient electronic music artist called Mr. Kit, and we make pieces of music that are really immersive steps into the future. We call it field recordings from the future, and then we play the pieces of music in these places where people come in and lie down and listen to the music, and we transport them to the future. And my brief to him was that they should cultivate a nostalgia for the future. How do we cultivate a nostalgia for the future? How do we cultivate longing? Who are the best people in our culture at cultivating longing? They're generally not climate scientists. They're rarely climate activists. They're storytellers, script writers, street artists, poets, musicians. Those are the people that we need with us working alongside this, okay? And I wanted to just finish up with a story, and then we'll have some time for questions, which is in France, there's a young woman called Anaïg Plassard. And Anaïg is very inspired by this idea that we need to become more playful with time and with this time travel kind of idea. So she lives in Nantes, but she comes from a place in Brittany called Plabanec. And she wanted to start a transition town group in the place in Plabanec. So she made this film for French TV that was called Return to Plabanec. And one of the ways that she tried to get people interested in getting involved in this community project was that she rode through her town on a horse carrying a sign that said, "I've been to the future, we won," in French. And there's a lovely bit in the film where she goes to the petrol station and stands her horse where you would put your car to fill it with petrol and feeds it hay instead. She kind of reminds me of being as like a modern day Joan of Arc, really riding through the town. Okay, but you may remember recently in France there was the elections where after the first round the far right were in the strongest position, and for the first time since the 1930s the left managed to organize itself as a Front Populaire to try and resist that. So she went to that demonstration in Nantes in her time travel costume with her "I've been to the future, we won" sign. And this picture got in all the French newspapers. It went all over French social media. It got on French television, and she was really surprised. And I said, why do you think that happened? And she said, because I think when people are faced with something that feels really frightening, when the future starts to disappear from people, to have somebody who comes from that future and says, it's going to be okay, is a very powerful thing to do. So, yeah, I love what she does. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to wrap up here, and just to say, if you want to find out anything else about what I do, then there's some different things on there. You can find a podcast that I did called From What If to What Next on all the different places where podcasts live, and there's some links to my website. And I guess I would just finish by saying that it feels to me like there's something very powerful about trying to build a movement which is around telling different stories of different futures. And the more that I researched the book, and the more I looked around, the more I could see places where this was already starting. And a couple of years ago, I was in a place in France called Pontivy, and I gave a talk. And at the end, the first question was a man in the audience who said, "The last time I was in this room was a year ago, and I was here for a talk by a woman who was the last surviving member of the French resistance. She was 95. She was in the French resistance as a teenager. And somebody asked her a question if there was anything that all the people she knew in the French resistance had in common. And she thought about it for a while, and then she said, yeah, they were all optimists. For me, the thing about optimists is when you need them, you really, really need them. And I feel like we live in a time now where we really, really, really need them. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.